The Myth of Sisyphus. Act 1. The Rise of the Cunning King. In the days when gods walked closer to the earth, when the boundary between mortal ambition and divine will remained thin as morning mist, there was born to Aeolus, king of Thessaly, a son whose very name would echo through the ages as a warning whispered in the darkness of Hades itself. Sisyphus came into the world beneath storm-laden skies, the sixth son of royal blood, born into a house where brothers plotted against brothers, and ambition ran thicker than wine in the veins of kings. The birth itself was marked by portents that the court seers struggled to interpret. Thunder rolled across clear skies when the child drew his first breath, and the sacred spring that fed the palace ran backward for the span of 3 heartbeats. The old priestess who attended the birth claimed she saw eagles circling the tower, though no eagles nested in those mountains. And she whispered to her sisters that the child's eyes opened before his first cry, as though he came into the world already calculating its possibilities. The palace of Aeolus rang with the laughter and quarrels of princes who would each seek to carve their names upon the map of Hellas. There was Athamas, destined to rule Orchomenus, his eyes already calculating the wealth of grain fields. There was Salmoneus, whose arrogance would one day lead him to claim equality with Zeus himself, demanding sacrifice and worship as though thunder answered to his call. There was Cretheus, who would found Iolcus and Father Jason's lineage, and Perieres, who dreamed of southern kingdoms. And there was Sisyphus, the child who learned to walk by watching his brothers every step, who spoke his first words not in wonder, but in questions that cut to the heart of weakness and desire. Even as the youngest princes played at wooden swords and horses, Sisyphus observed the games of power that surrounded him. He noticed how his father's ministers bent their words when speaking of certain subjects, how visiting kings smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated advantage, how the servants' gossip often proved more accurate than the official reports of ambassadors. While his brothers practiced spearwork and chariot racing, Sisyphus haunted the corridors of the palace, learning to move so quietly that adults forgot his presence and spoke freely of matters they believed beyond a child's understanding. Even as a boy, Sisyphus possessed a mind that worked like quicksilver, catching the light of every conversation, every glance, every unspoken tension that passed between the adults who ruled his world. He learned to read the silences between his father's words, to understand that power was not simply inherited, but seized, held, and protected by those clever enough to see opportunity where others saw only custom. The nurses whispered that he never cried as an infant, but watched with eyes too old for his face, as though he had been born understanding that tears were the first weakness a king must abandon. By his 8th year, Sisyphus had begun to demonstrate the gift that would define his destiny. When merchants came to trade with the royal household, the boy would position himself where he could observe their negotiations. He learned to recognize the tells that revealed when a man was lying, when a woman was desperate, when both parties to a bargain believed they held the superior position. His tutors praised his quick mind for letters and numbers, but they grew uncomfortable when he applied the same analytical precision to their own words, catching them in contradictions and exposing the gaps in their knowledge with questions that seemed innocent but cut deep. The court began to whisper about the strange prince who seemed to understand too much, too young. Visiting nobles would find their private conversations somehow became common knowledge shortly after the boy had been seen in their vicinity. Servants discovered that tasks assigned in secret were mysteriously completed before they could begin them, as though someone had overheard instructions never meant for young ears. Yet no one could prove the child had done anything wrong, for he was always where he was supposed to be, always perfectly behaved, always ready with a smile that never quite reached those calculating eyes. When Sisyphus reached his 16th year, the time came for the sons of Aeolus to seek their fortunes beyond their father's hall. The tradition demanded that each prince prove himself capable of ruling by establishing his own domain, whether through conquest, marriage, or the founding of new settlements. His brothers departed to claim kingdoms in the fertile valleys of mainland Greece, each following paths that seemed ordained by their natures and ambitions. Athamas marched north with a formidable host, seeking to carve out territory through strength of arms. Salmoneus chose the rich lands of Elis, where he could impose himself upon established communities. Cretheus looked toward the coasts, where he might build a maritime kingdom. But Sisyphus looked south, toward the narrow bridge of land that connected the great peninsula to the northern kingdoms. While his brothers saw glory in commanding vast armies or ruling ancient cities, he recognized something more valuable than immediate power: position. There, where traders' ships passed between eastern seas and western harbors, where the very throat of commerce could be grasped by the right hand, he saw possibility gleaming like gold in sunlight. Others might rule more land, command more soldiers, or inherit greater treasures, but none would control what he intended to control: the flow itself. The decision puzzled his father's advisors, who counseled the young prince to seek easier conquests. The isthmus was wild, they argued, inhabited by rough mountain folk who would not easily bend the knee. It lacked the fertile plains that could support large armies, the ancient temples that commanded religious authority, or the established trade routes that guaranteed immediate wealth. Why struggle to build something new when there were kingdoms ripe for taking through marriage or conquest? Sisyphus listened to their counsel with the appearance of respectful attention, nodding at appropriate moments and asking questions that suggested he valued their wisdom. But privately, he had already completed calculations that reached far beyond their conventional thinking. He understood that inheriting power made one subject to the expectations and limitations that came with it, while creating power from nothing allowed one to set the terms by which it would operate. An ancient kingdom came with ancient enemies, old debts, established ways of doing things that constrained a ruler's options. A new kingdom could be built according to one's own design. The isthmus lay wild and largely unconquered, protected by hills and watered by springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth. Ancient peoples had built settlements there, but none had recognized the true prize that geography offered. The land itself seemed to resist easy conquest, with rocky soil that demanded patience and skill to cultivate, harbors that required significant work to clear and fortify, and mountain passes that could be easily defended but were difficult to control. Previous attempts at major settlement had failed, leaving behind ruins that served as warnings to the overly ambitious. Sisyphus arrived with a modest retinue and eyes that measured every slope, every harbor, every path that merchants might travel. Where others saw rugged coastline and tangled hills, he envisioned walls rising from cliff tops, harbors filled with ships from distant lands, and roads converging like the spokes of a wheel upon a single magnificent center. His first months in the isthmus were spent not in building, but in learning, walking every trail, mapping every stream, talking with the scattered inhabitants about patterns of weather and trade that previous settlers had ignored. The local tribes watched the young prince with suspicion born of experience. They had seen ambitious men come before, full of grand plans and quick to demand tribute or labor. Most such men departed when they discovered that the isthmus yielded its gifts grudgingly, requiring patience and wisdom rather than force. But this one was different. He came not with ultimatums, but with questions, not with demands, but with offers. He learned their language, participated in their festivals, and listened to their stories with an attention that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Slowly, carefully, Sisyphus began to weave the first threads of his great design. He negotiated agreements that appeared to benefit all parties, while gradually establishing his authority as the natural mediator for disputes, the obvious coordinator for shared projects, the logical center around which the scattered communities might organize themselves. When tribal leaders disagreed about fishing rights, he proposed solutions that seemed fair to all while establishing precedents for his role as arbiter. When traders needed safe passage through contested territory, he provided it in exchange for modest fees that seemed reasonable, but gradually created a web of obligation and dependency. He named his city Ephyra, after the mountain nymph whose streams fed the land. But from the first day of its founding, it was clear that this would be no ordinary settlement. Sisyphus planned each street with the precision of a spider weaving its web, ensuring that all commerce, all traffic, all movement of goods and people would flow through channels he controlled. He understood that trade was the lifeblood of cities, and that he who controlled the flow of blood controlled the heart itself. The location he chose for his city center was itself a masterwork of strategic thinking. Positioned at the narrowest point of the isthmus, it commanded both the eastern and western approaches to the peninsula. Ships seeking to avoid the dangerous southern route around the Great Capes would find themselves naturally drawn to Ephyra's harbors. Caravans traveling overland between the northern kingdoms and the southern settlements would discover that the city offered the safest, most direct route through territories that Sisyphus gradually brought under his influence. But the true genius of Ephyra's design lay not in its military advantages, but in its commercial inevitability. Sisyphus built not a fortress that might be besieged or bypassed, but a marketplace that became increasingly difficult to ignore. He established trade festivals that coincided with the sailing seasons, created standardized weights and measures that simplified negotiations, and instituted a system of commercial courts that provided predictable justice for disputes. Merchants who might have planned to pass through quickly found reasons to linger, opportunities to profit, connections that drew them back season after season. The early years of Ephyra's growth were marked by Sisyphus's particular gift for turning circumstance to advantage. When pirates raided coastal settlements, he offered protection for a price that seemed modest, but that established the precedent of his authority over sea lanes. When merchants feared the mountain passes, he built roads and charged passage fees that gradually created a monopoly over the safest routes. When rival settlements competed for the same trade routes, he negotiated treaties that somehow always left Ephyra holding the key to the most profitable arrangements. His subjects began to prosper, and prosperity bred loyalty, though those who looked closely might have wondered at the price others paid for their king's success. For Sisyphus had learned early that there were two kinds of wisdom in the world: the wisdom that bent the knee to accepted ways, and the wisdom that saw how accepted ways might be bent to serve one's purposes. He received guests with honor, as custom demanded, offering them the finest accommodations, the richest foods, the most entertaining company his court could provide. Yet somehow these guests, who arrived expecting the simple hospitality due to travelers, found themselves drawn into increasingly complex negotiations. A merchant seeking safe passage might discover opportunities for exclusive trading partnerships. A diplomat carrying messages between distant kings might learn of intelligence that could benefit his own ruler, available in exchange for certain considerations. The sacred laws of hospitality protected all who came under Sisyphus's roof, but they said nothing about what agreements might be reached during their stay. Contracts were written in language that seemed clear, but contained snares for the unwary, obligations that revealed their true weight only with time and circumstance. For a time, guests departed with their persons and dignity intact, their immediate needs fulfilled, their official missions accomplished, yet somehow finding themselves bound by webs of obligation they had not fully understood when first they gave their consent. But as Sisyphus's power grew, so too did his appetite for more direct methods of acquiring what he desired. The subtle manipulations that had once satisfied him began to seem insufficient, too slow, too dependent upon the cooperation of others. Why should he wait months or years for carefully crafted contracts to yield their profits when more immediate solutions lay within his grasp? The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but those who served him closely began to notice changes in their king's methods. Wealthy merchants who arrived at Ephyra's gates began to disappear with disturbing frequency. Their retinues would report that their masters had departed early, leaving behind sealed letters explaining urgent business elsewhere. The letters bore authentic seals, the handwriting matched perfectly, and the explanations seemed reasonable to those who did not look too closely. But the missing merchants were never seen again in any of the cities they supposedly sought to reach. The truth was darker than even the most suspicious observers imagined. Sisyphus had discovered that certain travelers carried wealth that could be obtained more efficiently through murder than through negotiation. Those who arrived without strong political connections, whose disappearance would not trigger investigations or reprisals, found themselves invited to private audiences that ended in hidden chambers beneath the palace. Their goods were quietly integrated into Ephyra's treasury, their servants given explanations that sent them away believing their masters had simply chosen new routes. The violation of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality that bound all civilized peoples, represented a crossing of moral boundaries that even Sisyphus's most flexible conscience had once respected. But the practical advantages proved irresistible. A single night's work could yield more treasure than months of careful trading, and the risks seemed manageable as long as the victims were chosen carefully. Travelers without powerful friends, merchants whose roots were unknown to their families, diplomats carrying messages between minor kingdoms. Such people vanished into the foundations of Ephira's growing wealth. The corruption spread beyond simple murder for profit. Sisyphus began to take a darker pleasure in the exercise of absolute power over his victims. In the moment when they realized that their trust in his hospitality had been fatally misplaced, he would engage them in philosophical discussions about the nature of justice and divine law, all while knowing that their deaths had already been decided. The intellectual exercise of justifying his actions to his victims became almost as satisfying as the material gains their deaths provided. Some whispered that Sisyphus possessed supernatural cunning, that he had made bargains with dark powers to enhance his natural gifts. Others suggested he had learned secrets from his divine bride that allowed him to see through mortal deceptions with more than mortal clarity. But those who studied his methods more carefully recognized something more disturbing than supernatural aid. This was simply what human intelligence could accomplish when freed from the restraints of conscience and convention. He respected the gods with proper sacrifice and festival, ensuring that no deity could claim neglect or disrespect. The temples of Ephira were magnificent, their priests well-fed and influential, their ceremonies conducted with meticulous attention to traditional forms. Yet, Sisyphus paid closer attention to divine quarrels and weaknesses than to divine commandments, filing away each piece of celestial gossip like a merchant stores valuable coins. He noted which gods felt slighted by their treatment in other cities, which goddesses nursed ancient grudges, which divine marriages were troubled by infidelity or neglect. The festivals he sponsored were lavish beyond anything the Isthmus had seen before, drawing worshippers and pilgrims from across the Greek world. But they also served as gathering points for information, opportunities to observe the representatives of rival kingdoms, chances to forge new alliances and identify emerging threats. A celebration honoring Poseidon might include prayers for safe voyages, but it also provided opportunities to learn which cities planned new maritime ventures, which trading expeditions were being organized, which naval forces might threaten established routes. As Ephira grew from settlement to city, from city to the jewel of the Isthmus, Sisyphus's reputation spread beyond his borders, like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Merchants spoke of the king who never lost a bargain, who somehow always managed to structure agreements that seemed fair to all parties, while ensuring his own advantage. Diplomats returned from his court with treaties that appeared favorable until their true implications became clear months or years later, when changed circumstances revealed clauses that had seemed innocuous but proved decisive. Kings who had thought to intimidate the upstart ruler of the Isthmus found themselves somehow in his debt, bound by oaths they had sworn without understanding their full weight. The stories that spread about him took on an almost mythical quality. It was said that he could predict the outcome of negotiations before they began, that he never forgot a debt or a favor, that he possessed maps showing every secret route and hidden harbor between Thessaly and Crete. Merchants claimed he could tell at a glance which ships carried valuable cargo, and which were decoys, which captains could be trusted, and which would turn pirate given sufficient temptation. Soldiers whispered that he knew the deployment of every army in Greece, the loyalty of every garrison commander, the contents of every treasury from Macedonia to the southern islands. Some of these stories were doubtless exaggerated in the telling, but enough truth lay beneath them to give even the most skeptical pause. Sisyphus had built something unprecedented, a kingdom that existed not through the traditional pillars of military might or divine sanction, but through pure information and influence. He commanded no great armies, claimed no descent from the gods, controlled no ancient religious centers, yet his power grew steadily, while kingdoms with far greater apparent advantages found themselves gradually marginalized. Yet it was not merely through trickery that Sisyphus built his power. He possessed a mind that could hold a dozen different schemes in balance, seeing how each piece of the great game might serve his ultimate design. His court became a place where the most complex problems found elegant solutions, where disputes that had festered for generations were resolved through arrangements that seemed impossible until the moment they were proposed. He was genuinely generous to those who served him faithfully, creating a core of loyal followers who understood that their prosperity was bound to his success. He showed mercy to enemies who yielded gracefully, incorporating them into his growing network rather than destroying them outright. But he was also ruthless to those who betrayed him, and his vengeance took forms that served as lessons to others who might contemplate similar betrayals. A merchant who broke a sworn agreement might find his ships mysteriously detained in every harbor he attempted to enter. A diplomat who carried false information might discover that his lies had somehow become known to every court in Greece before he could profit from them. A king who reneged on a treaty might wake to find his enemies inexplicably united against him, their previous conflicts forgotten in favor of a common cause. The genius of such punishment lay not in its severity, but in its apparent naturalness. Sisyphus's enemies rarely suffered obviously supernatural fates that might suggest divine intervention on his behalf. Instead, they found themselves victims of perfectly ordinary misfortunes that happened to occur with suspicious frequency and devastating effect. The appearance of natural consequence made resistance seem futile, while allowing Sisyphus to maintain the facade of innocence that protected him from direct retaliation. While other kings raged and warred and spent their strength in open battle, burning through resources and accumulating enemies with each victory, Sisyphus wove webs of obligation and advantage that grew stronger with each passing season. His patience was legendary and unnerving, for he seemed willing to wait years for the proper moment to collect a debt or settle a score. This quality made him a dangerous enemy and a valuable ally, for those who served his interests knew they could depend upon eventual reward, while those who opposed him understood that no betrayal would be forgotten. The years brought him wealth beyond measure, as trade routes that had operated for generations found themselves redirected through Ephira's markets. The city's harbor became a necessary stop for ships traveling between east and west, its overland routes the preferred path for caravans seeking safe passage through the isthmus. Tribute flowed in from communities that had accepted his protection, fees accumulated from merchants who used his roads and markets, and taxes multiplied as more people chose to live within his realm rather than risk the uncertainties of less well-governed territories. But wealth alone could not satisfy the hunger that drove him. Each success only revealed new possibilities. Each achievement suggested greater ambitions that lay just beyond his current reach. He had proven that a clever man could build a kingdom from nothing, that intelligence properly applied could triumph over traditional advantages of birth, military strength, or divine favor. Yet the very completeness of his earthly success had begun to point his thoughts toward realms that no mortal king had dared to challenge. He sought marriage not for love, though love might come, but for alliance that would lift his line above the petty concerns of mortal kings. His eyes turned skyward, toward the daughters of Atlas who danced among the stars themselves. The Pleiades, those 7 sisters whose light blessed sailors and guided the lost, seemed impossibly distant from a mortal king's reach. Yet distance had never daunted Sisyphus when the prize was worthy of the effort. The courtship of a stellar goddess required delicacy and planning that exceeded even his previous achievements. One could not simply send ambassadors to negotiate with the daughters of Atlas, nor offer conventional bride gifts to beings whose very nature transcended mortal understanding. Instead, Sisyphus embarked upon a campaign of such subtlety that its true purpose remained hidden, even from those who helped execute it. He began by establishing himself as a patron of astronomers and stargazers, founding a school at Ephora, where scholars could study the movements of celestial bodies without interference from more practical concerns. The knowledge they gathered served his commercial and military purposes, for understanding the stars improved navigation and allowed more precise timing of voyages and campaigns. But it also demonstrated his respect for cosmic order and his appreciation for the divine mathematics that governed the heavens. His festivals grew more elaborate, their timing calculated to coincide with significant stellar events, their ceremonies designed to honor not just the major Olympian deities, but the lesser-known powers that influenced fate and fortune. He commissioned poets to compose hymns celebrating the beauty and wisdom of the star daughters, artists to create images worthy of their celestial nature, architects to design temples that captured and reflected starlight in ways that seemed to bring heaven down to earth. Slowly, carefully, through intermediaries both mortal and divine, he began to make his interest known, not as a demand or even a direct request, but as an expression of admiration that gradually took more concrete form. He offered gifts that demonstrated understanding of what might please a being whose existence spanned cosmic cycles, observatories that would function for centuries, endowments that would support scholarship long after he was gone, festivals that would continue honoring the stars regardless of political changes. Yet distance had never daunted Sisyphus when the prize was worthy of the effort. Through careful negotiation, through offers that touched upon divine vanity and cosmic politics in ways that lesser mortals could never understand, he gradually approached the impossible goal. He learned which of the sisters might be most receptive to mortal attention, which celestial politics might make marriage advantageous, which divine precedents could be cited to make his suit seem less presumptuous. The negotiations took years, conducted through intermediaries who themselves often did not understand the full scope of what they were facilitating. Divine messengers carried carefully crafted proposals between earth and heaven, their contents revealing layers of meaning that demonstrated Sisyphus's understanding of celestial politics. He offered not just conventional bride gifts, but commitments that would bind his city and his bloodline to the service of cosmic order, promises that would make Ephora a permanent bridge between mortal and divine realms. When at last he won the hand of Merope, youngest and most beautiful of the Star Sisters, the achievement stunned even those who had learned to expect the impossible from the king of Ephora. The marriage negotiations had required him to demonstrate not just wealth and power, but wisdom that approached divine understanding, diplomatic skill that could navigate the complex relationships between celestial beings, and vision that extended far beyond mortal lifespans. The marriage was celebrated with festivities that lasted 7 days and nights, their magnificence carefully designed to honor both earthly and heavenly guests. Wine flowed like rivers, but it was wine that had been blessed by priests of 7 different deities and aged in caves where starlight entered through crystal formations. Music filled the air from dawn to dawn, but it was music composed according to mathematical principles that reflected the harmony of celestial spheres, performed by musicians who had studied under masters in distant temples. Representatives came from every major kingdom in the Greek world, for none dared refuse an invitation to witness such an unprecedented event. Kings who had viewed Sisyphus as an upstart competitor found themselves in the position of paying homage to a mortal who had accomplished what none of their lineages had ever approached. The marriage made political statements that would echo for generations, establishing Ephora as a power that transcended normal categories of mortal authority. But the celebration was more than political theater. Those who attended later claimed they had witnessed magic that night, as starlight seemed to gather more thickly around the bride and groom, as music achieved harmonies that touched something deeper than earthly emotion, as the very air shimmered with possibilities that transcended ordinary experience. Whether through divine blessing or supernatural influence, the marriage ceremony transformed both participants, binding them together in ways that created something new under the heavens. But those who knew the ancient lore whispered that Merope's star would shine dimmer than her sister's for her choice to wed a mortal, as though the heavens themselves mourned what they saw as a diminishment. The whispers suggested that divine blood, when mixed with mortal ambition, created combinations that troubled the cosmic order. Offspring who might inherit powers they were not meant to possess, destinies that could not be contained within the normal boundaries of human existence. Sisyphus cared nothing for such whispers, or perhaps he understood their true significance better than the whisperers themselves realized. He had bound himself to divinity itself, achieving something that placed him beyond the normal categories of mortal kingship. From that union came children who carried both mortal ambition and stellar fire in their veins, offspring whose very existence testified to their father's ability to transcend the limitations that constrained other men. His son Glaucus grew to manhood marked by intelligence that sometimes seemed to approach prophecy, able to read patterns in nature and human behavior that escaped ordinary observation. Through Glaucus would come Bellerophon, the hero who would tame Pegasus and slay the Chimera, deeds that required both mortal courage and something approaching divine insight. Sisyphus's line would spread across the Greek world, carrying forward a legacy that combined earthly cunning with celestial vision, creating descendants who would be remembered in song and story long after empires fell. His other children, too, showed signs of their mixed heritage, exhibiting gifts that marked them as something more than ordinary princes and princesses. They moved through the world with confidence that suggested they understood secrets hidden from others, spoke with wisdom that seemed drawn from sources beyond normal education, formed alliances, and achieved successes that consistently exceeded what birth and training alone could explain. The king himself found that marriage to a stellar goddess had changed him in ways that became apparent only gradually. His understanding of political currents deepened, as though he could perceive the larger patterns that shaped human events. His ability to predict the consequences of decisions improved, allowing him to structure agreements and alliances with even greater precision. Most significantly, his sense of what was possible expanded, as constant exposure to divine thinking stretched his conception of the boundaries that limited mortal achievement. His name would be remembered long after the stones of Ephora had crumbled to dust, carved into the genealogies of heroes, and whispered in the council chambers of kings who sought to understand how one man had achieved so much. Yet even as he celebrated his triumph, even as he watched his city rise in splendor and his influence spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water, something darker grew within the king's heart. Success bred appetite, and appetite bred the dangerous belief that he who had outwitted men might also outwit gods. The marriage to Merope had given him unprecedented access to divine society, opportunities to observe the Olympians at close range during festivals and family gatherings. What he saw there both reassured and disturbed him. The gods were indeed powerful beyond mortal comprehension, capable of reshaping reality with casual gestures, commanding forces that could level mountains or alter the courses of rivers. Ra had crumbled to dust, yet even as he celebrated his triumph, even as he watched his city rise in splendor and his influence spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water, something darker grew within the king's heart. Success bred appetite, and appetite bred the dangerous belief that he who had outwitted men might also outwit gods. Sisyphus began to notice things that other mortals overlooked, how Zeus's attention wandered during festivals, how the god-king's lusts led him into compromising situations, how divine quarrels created opportunities for clever mortals to profit. He filed these observations away as carefully as he stored grain against winter, not yet knowing how dearly such knowledge would cost. The city of Ephyra flourished under his rule, its harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world, its markets rich with goods that spanned from amber of the distant north to spices of the far south. Sisyphus had achieved what few mortals even dared to dream. He had built something lasting, something magnificent, something that would endure long after his mortal form had returned to dust. His throne sat secure, his treasury overflowed, his family was blessed by divine blood, and his reputation for wisdom and cunning spread to every court in the Greek world. But in the depths of his satisfaction, in the very completeness of his earthly triumph, lay the seeds of a hubris that would shake the foundations of heaven itself. For Sisyphus had begun to believe that his cleverness was not merely a gift, but a power that placed him beyond the reach of consequence. He had tricked merchants and kings, had negotiated with river gods and won the hand of a stellar goddess, had built a city that rivaled the greatest settlements of the ancient world. What, he began to wonder in the dangerous privacy of his thoughts, might prevent him from matching wits with the highest powers of all? The question took root in his mind, like a seed planted in fertile soil, growing stronger with each passing day, each new success, each moment when his cleverness proved superior to the conventional wisdom of his time. He did not yet know that some questions, once asked, demand answers that reshape the very cosmos to provide them. He did not yet understand that the gods, who had watched his rise with amusement, were beginning to take notice of the mortal king, who seemed to believe himself beyond the reach of divine justice. He could not foresee that his greatest triumph was about to become the foundation of his most terrible downfall. But in the warm evening air of Ephyra, as he stood upon his palace balcony and looked out over the city he had built from nothing but ambition and wit, Sisyphus felt only the satisfaction of a man who had seized destiny by the throat and bent it to his will. The stars wheeled overhead, including the dimmed light of his wife's celestial home, and the king of Ephyra smiled to think that he had reached so high and grasped so much. Below him, the city settled into evening's peace, its citizens secure in their prosperity, unaware that their king's thoughts were turning toward questions that would soon draw the attention of powers beyond mortal understanding. In the growing darkness, Sisyphus planned new schemes, considered new possibilities, and dreamed dreams of cleverness that would eclipse even his greatest achievements. The age of consequences had not yet begun.